Hello and welcome to the first in a series of Security Weekly Unlocked webcasts. In each of these webcasts, we're tackling the topics that really matter to us, and we'll be bringing on some special guests to help us out with each of them. Today's webcast is Do It Yourself, Building a Security Lab at Home. I'm Adrian Sanabria, and we've got a full house of lab experts to walk us through a few different types of labs. First, we've got Paul Asadorian, Doc Master and founder of Security Weekly.
Hey, what's up, Adrian? It's good to be here. Good to be here.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, you're going to walk us through quickly setting up some vulnerable targets in your lab. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. It builds on previous technical segments that I've done. I did one on Paul Security Weekly where I was like, yeah, I can use this bash script to like spin up Docker containers, and I really wasn't happy with it. I'm like, I really believe I could use Docker kind of more natively and using Docker Compose to get what I want. And so that's what I'm going to show today, including if you go to github.com/security weekly, like all the stuff is there. All the stuff I'm going to show you today and all of the things that I've done more recently on technical segments on Paul Security Weekly, it's all there in our GitHub repo.
Awesome. And then we've got Mr. Tyler Robinson, Director of Offensive Security and Research at Trimark Security, founder and CEO at Dark Element, security researcher, pen tester, Security Weekly co-host, and living NFT. Tyler, tell us what you're going to be covering today.
Yeah, I'll be kind of diving in on a couple tips and tricks, things that will help you kind of get started, as well as a few pro tips just from many decades of playing in labs, building labs. Go through some of the hardware technical things, as well as resources for automating a lot of these labs. There's great ways to do this more efficiently. I'll cover why manually is good to learn, but I will also go through some of the automated ways to kind of scale this out, make it repeatable, make it usable for operations and testing, and kind of provide more resources. This is not a large enough webinar in order to do the whole gamut of things that we want to cover. So maybe we'll do a few series of different webinars about these. So.
And that's a good lead-in. Let us know in the comments, especially after we start going through some of these, if you want to see some deeper dives into any of these topics, more lab stuff, or maybe deep dives on specific tools. And finally, we've got Mr. Mike Shima, Senior Security Evangelist at GitLab, host of Application Security Weekly, lover of cats and sci-fi metaphors. Mike, tell us what you're going to go through.
I'm going to cover through slight bio tweak, not at GitLab though. So we'll fix that info, but no big deal, because the important thing for everybody is here for is to hear about building application testing lab, primarily web application testing, and kind of like what Tyler was saying, we're going to go on a bit of adventure. So roll up some D&D characters, and we're going to go on some adventure through web application testing. But at the end, also want to know what would you like to learn about more, and some teasers on lots of things can be an application, from IoT devices to reverse engineering to fuzzing to gaming to hardware hacking, all sorts of things. So I think this is hopefully just going to be a taste, and the kind that we want to also have a lot more discussions about. So it's looking to have some fun and getting a lot of questions and feedback about what's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that point, feel free to ask questions throughout this webcast, and we'll keep an eye on them and answer as we can. All right, and with that, let's jump right in. Everybody can see my screen, I hope. My slides here.
I see. Yes,
There,
yes,
now
we can.
change.
All right. Yeah, so like I mentioned, we are going to have a giveaway. You need to be into Discord to participate in that giveaway. You can go to securityweekly.com/Discord or /subscribe.
That excludes like Security Weekly employees and hosts, right? We don't qualify. We can't win our own giveaway, guys. It's for the audience.
Good point. Good point, Paul. So I will ask a challenge question later in this webcast, and first person to get it right basically wins this $50 Hacker Warehouse gift card. They've got all kinds of cool gadgets, like a lot of cool pen test hardware. All right. So first off, the question: why build a lab? For a lot of people, it's pretty simple. It's learning. It's getting to practice these skills. When you don't necessarily have the job yet that you want, it's a great way to get experience, get familiar with it. It's how I got into the industry. I built not just a lab at home. I ran my own websites and email off my broadband back in the late 90s and early 2000s, which was
kind of like a lab. Yeah, it's kind of like a lab at that time.
And then other people asked me to run their websites for them. Running stuff in production at your home, I wouldn't recommend it, but it's a good way to just kind of throw yourself in the deep end and learn how to do stuff.
Yeah. Also, I think Title 18 is also a good reason to build a home lab, as you don't want to test this on systems that you don't have permission for, because unauthorized access to computer systems as part of the CFAA is in fact illegal. At least that's the law in this country. I'm sure there are laws in other countries as well.
Very good point. And back in our early days, there weren't all these great intentionally vulnerable apps and resources for us to go after. So yeah, I don't think we knew what Title 18 was back then either. So it was a different time. But yeah, certainly, for some people, that get into get onto the bug bounty platforms and get into that as an additional source of income. That's another good reason to build a lab at home. So you can do some industry research or earn some money from finding bugs. So certainly this is a topic. There's even, of course, there's a subreddit for it. There are actually more than one home lab subreddits. This one clearly has the most ridiculous builds.
Is that yours, Adrian?
That is not mine. Oh, that is somebody built custom cabinetry just to do their home lab and custom lighting and everything. You don't have to do that.
I'm jelly, very jelly.
There was a time in my life when I had 2.5 racks in the garage, and that time is gone. I haven't gotten rid of everything at home. At one point, I tried to do my entire lab in the cloud, but it got expensive. It got tricky. We'll talk about that a bit more here in a few minutes. Honestly, you can dual purpose a machine you already have. If you've got enough RAM, you can run VMs. If you've got enough storage, you can build a bunch of VMs. You don't have to run them all at the same time. You do want to make sure you've got a chipset, that'll let you do virtualization at the hardware level. You can go without it. I wouldn't recommend it. Emulators are going to eat up a lot of CPU otherwise. But yeah, you can start out pretty humble and just build as you need to, is the point here. This is a nuke that I just got delivered, an Intel nuke. Or NUC. I don't know how people pronounce that.
Oh, you certainly know. You're like the biggest evangelist for NUCs, Adrian.
But I've heard people pronounce it both ways. I don't know what the proper way to do it is.
He loves them. There's nothing wrong with that.
I do love them. I wish I had one unplugged right now that I could show you. I've got 3 of them now. One with 8 gigs that was sadly soldered on board, but then 2 others that are expandable. And that's definitely something you want to look for in lab equipment. Even if you go small with an Intel NUC like this, they have versions with the RAM soldered on that you don't want, and versions that are expandable, where you can add tons of storage. Like this one you see in the picture here, I can put 2 drives in there. I can get like 32 terabytes of storage in this tiny thing, and it fits in the palm of my hand. It's an Intel i7, 6 cores. This one has 64 gigs of RAM.
And I think, Adrian, if you're constrained for space and or concerned about heating and cooling issues, the NUC platform is definitely the place to go.
Or noise. Noise is another big thing that a lot of people are running. And then the new NUC, the new Skull, not the Hades Canyons, are all hot swappable now too. So the entire motherboard, processor, and insides essentially swap out for next generation. So you can actually do different builds, different hot swaps, and upgrade on the same platform. It's kind of a new model that they've started to build. So very interesting.
Yeah, and those are bigger. Those are like
they're-
8 inches by 8 inches, something like that, but they're still pretty small compared to, your usual, full ATX build or something like that.
And you're not getting an RTX 3090 in one of those.
Right.
Even
Yeah,
if you could,
they will take a video card, some of the Quattros, but they will not take a full size. Will not take a full size.
Oh, there you go.
yeah.
Cool.
And you got to be careful of your power consumption when you're adding video cards as well. Especially we have an RTX 3090 in studio, and
The lights flicker.
yeah, there's like 4 runs from the power supply into the thing. So
yeah. So another neat thing is these ship with brackets so that you can just mount it on the back of any monitor that has Visa mounts on the back of it. If you're not using a monitor mount for your monitor, you can hide it behind the screen there, which is pretty nice. Eventually, so this is I wasn't using a whole closet, so I turned, this is where my lab lives. And I honestly just started out with a $150 laptop, secondhand laptop that somebody sold me. It's an old HP ZBook G1 that had 32 gigs of RAM in it. I might be able to upgrade it even more from there. But honestly, I put a Ubuntu on it, and it served my needs for a while, and I just kind of built out from there. And so point here is you can start out simple, you can start out cheap, use hand-me-down stuff and just build up as you need. You don't have to throw a ton of money at this.
yeah, I agree, Adrian. You can find secondhand IoT-based devices. You can put Linux on laptops, desktops, either free or really cheap. Right, I buy some of the. If you want to go blade server and you don't care about noise and heat and power, you can buy blade servers pretty cheap on eBay.
Yeah, and so we're going to get into considerations here because certainly noise and heat and power are all considerations. Some folks are fine with grabbing a rack, racking stuff up. Yeah, you can get used enterprise level stuff pretty cheap because it's big, it's hard to sell. People oftentimes will just give it away if you're willing to take it. It's kind of like the piano of the infrastructure world. Nobody wants to keep that stuff around. Just a quick note here. If you just joined Discord, you do need to verify your account. You should have a message from the CAPTCHA bot with a CAPTCHA to complete. So go ahead and do that, and you'll be able to join in the discussions on here. So some considerations real quick. Don't just start building without considering your goals. Depending on your goals, like if I'm doing malware research, I'm going to build a different environment than if I'm just doing security research. Say I'm doing OSINT research, I plan on using Maltego and stuff like that. Very different build than I'd go with if I'm going to be handling malware on my home network or on a lab network or something like that. Probably going to put more. Honestly, I'm not even going to do it on my network. With malware stuff, I generally spin up stuff in AWS that's completely segregated from anything I have at home, just as an insulating layer against foot gunning myself. So for a lot of the stuff I do, I actually keep around, people will give me old gear, and I'll keep it. And surprising amount of time, I'll find uses for old Macs, old laptops and stuff like that. So I've got a variety of different versions of Windows from XP on up, older Macs to current Macs, and various different versions of Linux, Android, iOS devices, all kinds of stuff. So I'm ready to test a little of everything because that's what I tend to do. Also a consideration if you do an IoT testing, for some kinds of testing, you might want to have the ability to sniff traffic in line. So there's, I mentioned Hacker Warehouse. You can get a passive LAN tap from them. That's one way of doing it. There's a pretty inexpensive, I forget the number of it, but there's an inexpensive Netgear switch you can get that supports port mirroring. So there's some options out there to do that fairly easily.
I bought, speaking of enterprise gear, I bought Cisco 3500 series switches and did the span port and port mirroring on those. They were
There you go.
relatively inexpensive.
I bet my Netgear is quieter though. My 5-port.
That's the thing with the enterprise gear. Yes, it's very noisy.
And that's the slide we're on here. So yeah, noise, heat, especially dust. A lot of this stuff. If it generates a lot of heat, it's going to have a lot of fans, which means it's going to suck in a lot of dust, which means it's going to die if you don't clean it on a fairly regular basis. Ask me how I know from running 2.5 racks in the garage through all seasons. Also, the typical gaming PC, if a PC is good for gaming, it's probably good to run a lab. If you don't need your lab running 24/7, totally dual purpose a gaming PC to also function as a lab PC. That's a great way to cut down on expenses and space if it's tight. Also, like I was mentioning before, you can get old rack mount server stuff pretty cheap, if not free, from people who just want to get rid of it. Same thing with older, Lenovo, especially the laptops that aren't really portable, that are meant as like workstation replacements. They're not very attractive when they're a couple of years old, so you can get them cheap. Like I mentioned, that HP ZBook I got for $150. You can get crazy Lenovo like workstation desktop replacement series laptops for a couple $100. They don't keep their value like Macs do. And you can get tons of RAM and a pretty big CPU, and even discrete GPUs, really cheap in an old Windows laptop. And then if you're going to do stuff in the cloud can get pretty expensive. So I mean, the nice thing is you can turn it off whenever you want, but do keep an eye on billing. I've had a couple situations where I was teaching a class and had stuff spun up in AWS and forgot to spin it back down. Then a month later, you get a bill for a couple $100 you weren't planning on. So you do have to keep track of that. And honestly, I run more. I don't use the cloud unless I really have to for a use case, because now I do have several lab PCs here in my home. I'm just going to use those. The cost is already sunk. Why not? Oh, and security in the cloud. Yeah, make sure you secure your clouds, because jumping in there and mining Monero is a thing. People, if they get access to your cloud, they will jump in there, run up a bill on GPU instances, mining cryptocurrency. So be wary of that. Software. This is just a sampling, all kinds of stuff. Again, you can get away with free stuff. Sometimes it's worth it to pay for Burp Suite if you're doing a ton of AppSec testing. But for the most part, there are free tiers for this stuff. Postman, free tier, Shodan, free tier, Android Studio, Ghidra, both free, depending on what you want to do. And then finally, if you're going to collaborate, I think this is my last slide before I hand off here, there is a lot of good free stuff out there as well. One of the challenges I find is if I'm doing malware analysis or offensive security testing, it can actually be hard. Like, even if you have recently had a situation where the spreadsheet had some attack commands in the spreadsheet, and email security was blocking it, AV would quarantine it. So I actually use a service called Cyph, which creates a secure messaging app in a Docker container, where the moment you're done with the session and you close the tab in your browser, that Docker container gets destroyed. But I found that a nice, easy way to share stuff, share files. So there's some good solutions out there. Zero Tier is another one. It's kind of like software-defined networking, where I can give anybody in the world access to one machine on my network, and only one machine using this. Nothing to open on my firewall. Don't have to expose a VPN or anything like that. It feels kind of magical. It's just creating IPsec tunnels point to point. So pretty neat. And again, free tier. Pretty neat product there. All right. And with that, I think I am going to hand off to you, Paul.
Sweet. Alrighty, let's see if I can start the slideshow. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yep.
Looking good.
Sweet. So if you want vulnerabilities, I've been working on a few different kind of lab projects recently. I actually won't talk about VirtualBox and how we set up for some of our labs testing here at CRA, Adrian and company. We can probably do that at a later time. I was focused on doing some of the Docker-based lab setups for various reasons. And I think for me, it's when we need to talk about an exploit and associated vulnerability, and I actually want to do it. Like I want to test it, but I have to spin up a lab in order to get the right components going in order for me to test it so that we can talk about it on the show and do some kind of technical segment. So I want to be really fluid with my lab. And I find Docker is a great way to do that. Now, what's interesting is I've always wanted to have a giant collection of vulnerable Docker containers. So I clicked my heels 2 times and I wished, and then I Google searched on the internet and I found VulHub. And someone, lo and behold, had created a GitHub repository that has a whole bunch of vulnerable Docker containers. So it saved me a whole ton of work. And a lot of my work in getting my own labs up and running has been using and customizing these containers. Now, some you can modify the Docker file or spin up your own kind of thing and modify it heavily. Others rely on just pulling the image that's already created, and oftentimes that works. But this is a great way to spin up a lab. Now, in previous segments, I had a shell script that was like selectively launching and spinning up some Docker containers, and I'm like, there's a better way to do this, and I can do this all in Docker Compose. And so I'm going to try it that way. And I'm sure there's even better ways to do this, but this is just kind of where I'm at in my journey of being able to easily spin up a lab. So then I got thinking about some other things that I wanted in my lab. One, I wanted a vulnerable container just to run Telnet, as I presented previously in a technical segment. So I made sure that was included in this setup, and it has a default set of credentials on it, so I can test some of my other scripts in password brute force and password guessers, right? So I put that in the mix, and I said, it'd be really interesting. I really want to have Kali Linux or some attack platform, so I chose Kali Linux to be able to spin up in this environment as well, so that I can download and or configure and install tools inside of a container, basically make a mess inside of that container rather than my own Linux desktops or spinning up another virtual system and trying to network it together with Docker. So that last link on this slide, github.com/securityweekly, the repository is called VulHub Lab. It gives you all the components you need to basically spin up everything that I spun up in this lab. So I'll walk you through what I did, including some options you have for getting Kali Linux container inside of this environment, and how to properly set up networking inside this environment as well. So this is, if you apply some filtering on IP tables for extra layers of protection, this entire lab actually spins up on its own subnet, and every container has its own unique name and IP address. And what that allows you to do that I thought was really awesome, so many of the other projects that are working with VulHub will have you do the port mapping, right? You map a local port on localhost on your computer to a port inside of the container. And since you can't have the same port listening on the 127.0.0.1, you end up with all these crazy port mappings. Like, oh, wait, the log4j, that was localhost :8084 is what I mapped that to. And I was like, that's really clunky. So in this configuration that I'm about to show you, you can access these containers by IP address, and you can have multiple containers, since they all have their own IP address inside of a Docker virtual network. They can all be listening on port 80, for example. And then I just reference them to my name. So when I want to go to log4j vulnerability, I use an Etsy host entry, which I'll show you, and I just go there, and that's my log4j, and that can be listening on whatever port I want. So I thought that was a really cool kind of little trick that I'll show you how I did that.
And ngrok is another option too, that you can pass that back and forth, even from web containers back to a host name that you control. And if you do a pro ngrok, you can use custom URLs for some of that as well. So an additional
I have yet to
do that in the cloud.
Funny you say that. I've yet to grok ngrok. Like I've seen it, I've read a little about it. That would be an amazing
So useful.
Yeah, I've heard you talk about it before, and one of our interns was using it for a specific use case once too. So I think that would make a great segment as well.
Put it on my notes.
So you can see here, I've got this is your standard Docker Compose file, and in each of these sections for the container that I'm telling Docker Compose to spin up or the image to use, I have a link to the GitHub repository for that container. So for the shell shock vulnerability, I'm spinning up a container from VolHub, and I link to that at the top. And what that link is going to give you is access to the Docker file and or Compose file, original one they used to spin it up, and also a README. And oftentimes you get a README file that tells you how to exploit the vulnerability that's inside this container. So I spun one up with the bash shell shock vulnerability. Again, the README walks you through how to exploit that container. I give the container a name. I map it to port 80. I give it a host name as well, and I give it an IP address. So you can see where I say networks. I created a new network called VolHubNet, and I gave it a separate subnet that was separate from anything else that I had, and I assigned it an IP address. So that's that first block right there. Again, it pulls an image from VolHub to spin up a vulnerable container. Nothing earth-shattering there. There are some volume mappings for some of these containers as well to basically get some vulnerable files that it may need or some configuration files into your vulnerable container. So I've cloned those specific directories, and basically I'm launching this script with select directories that I've copied over from the main VolHub repository. The next one I'm spinning up is Jenkins, because Jenkins has some pretty juicy vulnerabilities as well. In this one, I'm spinning up the container with a specific vulnerability in it. So you'll see inside of VolHub, if you go into Jenkins or some of the other directories in there, right, they'll have a specific CVE number. And the Docker Compose file or Docker file, depending on the configuration, will be a container that will have that specific vulnerability. So I chose CVE 2018 1861 as vulnerable. And again, the instructions are in there on how to exploit those vulnerabilities. That's not to say it's not vulnerable to multiple things as well. So it makes a pretty good kind of lab test. So I did that, and I told it to spin up on some different ports for Jenkins, the default ports for Jenkins. So then this is all the same script. So now I'm starting up phpmyadmin, because who doesn't love a good, juicy, vulnerable phpmyadmin? We love it when we find that on pen tests. Do you still find that on pen tests, Tyler? Is that still a thing? I'm sure people still using phpmyadmin. I mean, you really shouldn't, but in any case.
PHP still heavily used, like whether PHP admin's a lot less now, but you'd be surprised how they creatively find ways to insert phpmyadmin into other applications. Yeah,
it's kind of the lazy person's way to change configs and database stuff, right? And so for phpmyadmin, you also need to have a database. So this was in the phpmyadmin configuration. So I do spin up a database just for phpmyadmin. Conceivably, you could spin up multiple databases, or you get really fancy and have one container with multiple databases in it. Again, we're not really worried about running a production level. Like, I would never do this in a production environment. It'd separate everything. So this is kind of hacking Docker so that these are larger containers than I would normally build, but allows you to spin up this environment. So like, don't do this stuff in production. See my other segments on Docker containers for more production ready stuff. So this gets you phpmyadmin in this configuration. And again, I'm assigning a specific IP address and host name to all of these containers. And then I'm building out a Telnet server. So this is one that someone had done some work on GitHub to build a Telnet server. Their GitHub repository, which I linked to in other segments as well, was a couple of years out of date. So I made some changes to this build. So you can see here where it says Telnet server on line 59. On line 60, I'm not telling it to use a Docker image. I'm telling it to go build a container from a local directory. So inside the directory called Telnet server is my Docker file, which has all of the instructions to build a vulnerable Telnet server that I then had to modify slightly to get working because the previous work was a couple of years old. And that Docker file and all these files are available in our own GitHub repository. So you can go spin this up on your own. I'm telling that to listen on port 23. Essentially, I had this container to, excuse me, test a script that was doing password brute forcing, credential brute forcing attempts. Log4j is a fun one. I did a technical segment on this one, so I thought, why not throw this into my one command, spin up a vulnerable lab. So I included the container image that comes from VulHub that uses Apache Solr, which I can't remember what Apache Solr is. It's a project from Apache. Do you guys remember what Apache Solr is? I don't remember. It's not a queuing system. It's something like that.
Was that their text search? I can't remember too.
I think it did have something to do with searching. I think you're right, Mike.
Database, yeah.
Yeah, it's enterprise search, so kind of
Yes.
like remembering Google had an appliance that you could
Right.
run against your internal stuff. Yeah.
Yes, so that was Solr. So this version of Solr has a Log4j vulnerability, which is what I've been using for my testing for Log4j exploits and payloads, and it works really well. Well, it works in the sense that it's vulnerable and you can exploit it. Yeah, Apache is a search platform, and that listens on port 8983 by default. So this is the Telnet Docker container. And so this is the script that I had to modify. I think I had to increment it from Ubuntu 16 to 18, and I made some other changes to basically make this work so that when the container spins up, it will listen on, start a Telnet server and listen on that with some default passwords. And you can change that. If you look at line 13 here, I'm setting the username root with a password TOOR. You can change that to whatever you want for your various testing. I kind of like this, again, for testing scripts that are looking for default passwords, is why I have this container. You could use it for any kind of testing as well. Then this is still, so now we're jumping back into, I should say, the Docker Compose script that I built, and I'm spinning up Kali Linux. Now, a couple of things about Kali Linux. You can spin up like the default image, but it didn't give me enough control over what was happening in Kali. I wanted some of my own kind of controls over what was happening when I built out Kali Linux. And you're going to build Kali Linux. Rolling is the latest image that they make available. But in my Docker file that I put together, I'm building Kali Linux headless, which is one of the smallest kind of templates they put together. And it's still pretty big. So in other words, when you build this the first time, so the first time you do docker-compose up-d, Docker's going to go ahead and it's going to build Kali Linux, and it's going to install all of the utilities that come in Kali Linux headless. I forget the exact apt command, but I'm installing a base set of packages. It's quite a few packages. It takes a really long time to build it the first time. But once you build it the first time and spin up your lab, then you're just reusing the image that you built. And if you want to update the image, you can go in and destroy, your image and or use other command line options to Docker to basically rebuild your Kali Linux image if you want to update your utilities. So I thought it was a pretty cool way. And again, it's customizable. It depends on what you want. You can change my config. You can actually change my Docker file not to install anything by default. And when this Docker container spins up, you can install the tools you need to accomplish a goal, or you can put inside that Docker file like, hey, every time I build my lab, I want to make sure that I have Nmap and that I have Netcat and that I have this base set of utilities. So you can kind of customize your own Kali Linux, attack launching container that will get on the network. And I also think, I don't know if I modified my Docker file so that you could SSH into it. However, that's a pretty easy thing to do. I might have done that, but it's not that hard that when this image spins up, you can make it so that you could SSH into it. And since you're assigning it a static IP address and host name that you put in your Etsy host file, you could always just SSH over to it. Now, the line 92 through 98 does all of the magic to build out a network. So your local host essentially becomes the gateway at 10.1.1.1. If you were to bridge or route this interface onto your production network, your entire vulnerable lab could be available. So I don't do that, and I just create a separate subnet. So this is only accessible conceivably to me, depending on your configuration again. But I access all of these, from my one computer that's spinning up this spinning up these Docker containers. Okay, so this is the Docker file that I'm using. And again, you can change this for your needs, but this is the one that I'm using in order to get Kali Linux up and running. And I'm installing Kali Linux Headless, which is the meta package that installs a whole bunch of utilities. So those are commands you need to get Kali Linux up and running. Again, customize to your requirements. Once you spin all of this up, it's really amazing because you can open up a web browser and access all of these applications. Some of these are web applications, which Mike will talk more about, and some of these are Linux systems that are just hanging out and vulnerable to things like Telnet and shell shock and other things. In the very lower right-hand corner, you can see I'm just using a Docker exec command to get a shell inside of my Kali Linux container. Again, you can modify the Docker file if you so choose so that you can SSH into it. In this example, in the lower right, I'm running nmap on that network and finding all of my vulnerable targets. I also need to, I don't know, did I put the host file in here? I apologize, I didn't. I do have in the GitHub repository a complete mapping of host names and IP addresses that you can add to your Etsy host file that makes all of these accessible by name. I'm sure you folks can figure that out. Again, actually at the end in the comments of the Docker Compose file on GitHub is an example Etsy host file entries for this entire lab. So that is my section.
All right. Tyler, do you have a hard stop? I was considering going to Mike next because I think we might run a little bit long, and he does. No? Okay.
No, I'll let Mike go. Just because I love him so much. He's always such a good looking guy.
I think you need to perform the handoff, Paul.
Oh, okay. So I go into, where did you guys go?
If you right-click the name, I think it works.
I mean, if you would have stuck around for the dry run, Paul, we practiced handoffs.
Yeah, that's the one I had to join from my phone.
Yeah, that was funny.
I see it. So I'm passing this off to Mike. Make presenter.
Yep.
Okay, passing off to Mike.
All right, so let's see if I have this set up right. Slideshow. Play. And I'm not showing the white run quite yet. Just a second.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Somebody mentioned that, like in a commercial switch, they swapped out quiet fans for the stock ones. That wouldn't even occur to me.
There we go.
That's a pretty cool tip there.
That is a cool tip, and something that you really do have to consider. You get a couple blade servers running, or even a couple decent sized desktops
like
going.
A jet plane.
It's hard to have a conference call. You kind of have to put some stuff to sleep. Not to mention any of the miners you got running, like usually.
Well, I definitely will try not to put anyone to sleep with a quick run through of some AppSec labs. So you all have been, Paul just gave a good summary of setting up some infrastructure. Adrian gave some great insights on some hints on both the virtual and your cloud environment, as well as some hardware to run on. And I'll run through some web. And the reason I like the web is that it's ancient. So if you look at MTV, for example, what it looked like in 1999 or what it looks like yesterday, is still just HTTP, which is text. It's HTML, which is text. It's JavaScript, which is unreadable text, but it's still text. And that means that the tooling tends to be a little bit easier, and it just needs a little bit more of your brain power. So really, all we're going to need, for the most part, is a browser. And the reason because everything has a web page on it these days. And of course, Adrian alluded to this earlier on about why we want to do web app testing. It's everything from experimenting, scanning. We're going to want to store a lot of our data from scanning. So so that's why you'd want some nice terabytes of storage. And we're going to do some analysis, everything from just a grep to maybe a semgrep out there. Some really cool tools if you're going to dive into the source code side of things. Also a great way to learn some new tech stacks, struggle with some old tech stacks, like Paul was just telling us about phpmyadmin. Just learning how to get PHP and old versions of phpmyadmin up and running is honestly a great way to learn the basics of web application programming. And that leads into understanding how to test it, because developers make mistakes, and understanding the types of mistakes or the types of thought process they go through, really helpful. And of course, as Paul was also showing us, it's a great way to reproduce CVEs. So Shellshock, super easy one to exploit via web browser. A lot of them were exploited by some fancy header values. So really cool there. Obviously Log4j, another very recent one that was very easy to reproduce through the web. And of course, if you want to make a little bit of money, or a lot of money if you're really lucky, there's bug bounties. So in addition to the
Mike,
browser,
one addition that you reminded me of,
yes.
Pen Tester Academy.
Mhm.
Basically, like what I did manually and created, you can pay and register for an account at Pen Tester Academy. Vivek does an amazing job in team. And it essentially gives you what I gave you, right? It's a tutorial through a web browser. They spin up the containers for you, and it's a great service. I really love it. So I wanted to give them a plug.
Yeah, that's a great shout out to that too. And I have a couple other links too, but I neglected to include Pen Tester Academy. So that's a good shout out, because they do have such a wide variety of web application testing, even to very specific. This is where I want to play around with XXEs or OAuth tokens, or just get into other types of specific Docker containers with RCE. So has a really good variety of different types of vulnerabilities you might want to play with. And one of the things I wanted to highlight too, and this is where I get on my perhaps evangelism soapbox, is that you've got the browser, got an operating system. I'm going to talk in this about Mac OS. Obviously, we just heard a little bit about Kali. Good conversation in the Discord too, that Kali Linux is great because a lot of it comes pre-configured. The package management is easier because it's focused on a lot of the pen testing tools. But if you're pretty familiar with Linux, just choose the Linux that you like your package manager for. Kali's basically a Debian box. So if you want to go Debian just vanilla, go Debian vanilla, start installing the packages. The other thing you'll need, if you do want to dive into either the source code analysis or you're trying to build some of these applications, you'll need an IDE or one IDE. Honestly, the greatest things about IDE is just the syntax highlighting. You'll also want a Git repo. And the reason you want a Git repo is that I also like to point out that part of any toolbox you have, take notes. Because you'll start to forget things, especially as you get older. Dun, 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 giveaway there. But you might like to take notes in Google Docs. Perfectly great. It does wonders in terms of keeping track of links, linking to other items. If you just want to use text files in Vim and you just write a whole bunch of stuff in Markdown and keep notes in a Git repository, that's awesome too. I myself do a mix between Google Notes if I'm typing up things that I think are going to turn into like a report, or maybe I'll share that. I haven't done any bug bounty testing myself in a long, long time. But if it's the type of thing that I might cut and paste into a bug bounty report, maybe I'll use Google Notes, or I'll just use a lot of Markdown. So wanted to mention that. So we've now got then one last thing for configuring our OS. And this is where, with Mac OS in particular, could also be for you Linux fans out there, Brew. So Brew is pretty awesome because it is a great way to really easily and in a relatively compartmented way install all of the command line applications you might need. There's a couple common commands you'll need about upgrading, update. If you want to search for a fuzzer, search for a particular command line name or tool name, pretty easy to do. Just use the brew search command. But most of the time, you're just going to need that brew install and install what they call formulas, which are just some of the common applications you'll need. And some of those common applications, I organize into some big groups. So Paul was giving us some pointers on cloud, for example. All of the for AWS, Azure, for Docker, for that matter, a lot of command line tools you can just install and manage straight from Brew. Makes it super easy. Unfortunately, the one exception is Google Cloud. You have to go straight to Google Cloud and get their SDK installed from them. They're also pretty particular about the version of Python they like. But what's also really nice with Brew is that you can install any of these languages, Go, Python, Ruby, Rust. These are pretty common in the web app space, as general application space too. And things like Python and Ruby also have virtual environments. And so using like Python virtual environments also helps you install some vulnerable apps or install some tools like Dirbuster, subdomain busters, things like that that are kind of very focused bug bounty types of tools. And they might have particular dependencies, and your version of Python, your version of managing all the pip, all of the py that packages you've installed, those can get messy. So Python and the virtual environments, or Ruby and its virtual environments, excellent way to go. I'll hit those nifty networking because I love alliteration in the next slide, but a few extras.
Mike, I had a question about Homebrew. How does that work on the M1s? Is there stuff missing that they're not cross-compiling yet for that platform?
So far, I haven't run into anything that they're missing yet. I think they were pretty quick to get on to M1. I think the catch is going to be more that some of the packages may not be migrated themselves for M1. So that's more a case-by-case basis on the packages themselves. But as I list like the Go, Python, Ruby, Rust, all of those will be nice and speedy on the M1s too. So big thumbs up for that. Good question.
Awesome. We've got another question from the audience. Cactus was saying on Discord that getting Git repos configured with an IDE is a struggle. Any pointers there?
Ooh. No good pointers other than typically, I guess, sometimes it's context. I've playing around with, I use GitHub, honestly, because with GitHub now you can actually have private repos as well for free if you're at a low enough tier, and public repos, share your work. And it's been, I'll have to share some notes. I'll make a note of that to share how to set up your GPG keys and do signed commits as well as SSH access through the IDEs, because admittedly, I do it pretty much through the command line and I use syntax highlighting in Vim. So that's where I'm struggling to give you a really good direct answer on those. But I'll play around with them and throw together a couple of the examples of using Xcode, for example, or Visual Studio. They have community versions too. So you don't need to shell out a lot of money for that in order to be able to manage against GitHub.
Mike, I actually, I do that in PyCharm from JetBrains. And I've got that configured, so I can share. I can take some screenshots and share my config as well.
I do that in Visual Studio Code as well with Azure DevOps, and kind of the same thing. There's some setup things, and they have some great tutorials. But it would be very interesting to see some kind of secure tips to do that a little more efficiently, whether you're on Windows, Mac, or Linux. So obviously, there's three different things there that we've kind of mentioned, but Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio Community are good too.
Yeah, and I think one of the great examples too, I got some notes on a separate project on my own blog. I have signed commits, and I went through a bunch of Brew utilities to install to be able to have GPG signing, GPG so it connects into your keychain, so you just have to enter your passphrase once. A couple of things that just make life easier. On that note too, I will throw out there the Git LFS. So that's LFS for large file storage. I love Git for tracking all my markdown notes, markdown files. If you are going to be tracking for any particular reason, binaries, downloads, images, PDF files, it's okay to track them in Git, but throw them into the Git LFS extension. That way, the the change tree is going to be a lot easier, and it's not going to bloat so much. So that's just a neat thing. One-off tool JQ, or the Go version of GoJQ, is just a pretty printer for JSON. In the modern world, you're going to run into a lot of JSON blobs, start to maybe run into some protobufs as well, possibly less common, but JQ is a great tool for that. And links, just a command line or a curses-based web browser. So that's often what I like to throw up, just if I'm checking a website and I just want to pull down its source code, or it's also a nice way if I'm more concerned about, accessing unknown applications, unknown sites in my virtual environment. Going with links means I'm less likely to run into some potential 0 days or malware or something like that, as opposed to some of the modern browsers. And I'll come back to it, but a lot of these take a long time to download, long time to compile. Paul was telling us that. Homebrew has some games in there. One of my favorites is Angband, so it's good ASCII-based dungeon crawl. But one of the biggest things you're going to run into with web application testing, or honestly a lot of even mobile testing or IoT testing, is what Adrian alluded to earlier. You're going to need to intercept traffic, and a lot of times you're going to need to break the TLS and intercept that, intermediate the traffic, because I loved using that word, intermediation. Pretty much all of the tools that I'll talk about in a second, like Burp and those proxies, will automatically downgrade you from TLS 1.3 to 1.2, which makes it more viable to do this. 1.3 has some good design choices that make intermediation impossible, more difficult. That's a good design, but it's harder for testing. You'll have to go through and either muck about with your browser, your system's trust store for your certificates. So if you're doing this from your own system, just be aware that you're adding, self-signed certs, some, certs that you have generated yourself in there. They're not necessarily expanding your attack surface, because someone has to get that CA, that cert, to also target you, interrupt your own traffic. But in the spirit of endpoint security, be careful with those. And I mentioned you may need to chain some proxies. Sometimes just using network redirection like Ghost Tunnel, S-Tunnel, SOCAT for that matter, will come in handy, because those can proxy TLS connections. They can proxy IPv4, IPv6. If you do run into anything that's actually using IPv6, also really helpful. And then you can manage search from the command line, create them, generate them, sign them with OpenSSL, but I like Cloudflare's CFSSL. It's a Go-based project. It's just a lot more user-friendly. And with that, honestly, you just need to throw together now a proxy. The one that probably most people use is Burp from Portswigger. The OWASP has its own Z-Attack proxy, or ZAP, and both Java-based. ZAP is free. Portswigger has a community version as well as professional and enterprise licenses. You can really easily get started on the community version. There's also a Charles proxy that I've come across anecdotally. I kind of think that people tend to run that. It seems to be more popular with a Windows-based crowd. I'm not sure why, or if that still remains true, but you do have 3 choices out there, with probably Burp being the most common. And there was a mention for this before, but Postman is really great for all of your API endpoint testing. It just makes it a really nice way to enumerate APIs, interact with APIs, set up the request response analysis for them. Again, has free as well as commercial aspects to it.
Mike, one of the features in Postman that's saved my butt so many times is the one where I can kind of tune all the things in my post request and get it to go through. And then it's in the upper right-hand corner, and it converts your post request into 5 or 6 different languages. So you click Python, and it spits out Python code of here's how you send that same request in Python. I can't tell you how many times it's saved my butt in both, application security testing, in addition to running production applications and modifying production code.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's just just having that tool is a great quality of life improvement, because honestly, your web application testing lab is probably it's 90% a browser, maybe 1% having a proxy like Burp, and then the remaining percentage, I lost my math there, 9%, I suppose, is just developer tools and interacting with the web app. So, and that's kind of a theme with web apps, is that the more you just try to download and install one, the more you're going to learn a lot of just what it takes to put together, what the dependencies are, as well as reading through change logs about what were the security fixes that they just did, or rolling back to a version that prior to a security fix. I'm not going to go too, interest of time, I'm not going to go too deep into Burp, because Burp and Portswigger has some great documentation, and the interface can be kind of intimidating at first. Basically, the first menu you're going to need to go to is the proxy, and then options, just to make sure you've got a listener. And then under proxy and intercept is where you're going to basically be able to intercept traffic, stop and start. And there's a lot of fun things that you can then do. Paul was just mentioning about using Postman to generate requests for API requests in a bunch of different languages. With Burp, you can also do things like manipulate certain requests so that they get transformed in certain ways. Some requests are ignored. Some requests you're swapping out tokens for another token. And this is where you'll start to get into, I would kind of suggest, start with a proxy, play around with repeater menu, then maybe the intruder menu, and then maybe the sequencer. And sequencer is sort of like where you're trying to replay, rather than a single request and response, a whole bunch of request and response pairs. Like maybe it's a whole checkout process you're going through in an e-commerce site or something like that, or a more complicated authentication flow. But I have a link to some of the documentation for that. The other really great thing about Burp, Z-Attack Proxy has this too, is it's extensible. And go into here's a link to the BAP store, as well as I found a great list from Snoopy Security, who had a list of very useful Burp extensions. And these extensions are largely going to be around how to deal with a particular authentication workflow, or do some analysis on some authorization. So you log in as two different users, you can swap their cookies between each other, things like that. So that's why I don't have any one in particular I wanted to highlight, because they could be more contextual about what do you care about. But installing the extension is really easy. And again, Brew will help you out here, because some of the extensions you might need to have a Java, a JDK, might need to have some Python or some Ruby development environment to build and install an extension. All of that comes super easy. I do want to highlight, though, that there's some very often out-of-band testing that you'll need. And Burp, once again, is a great tool for this, because they have what's called a collaborator to help for blinded payloads. And these are things like dropping cross-site scripting payload into your name, so that if customer support actually looks up your name on a back-end system, that might trigger a cross-site scripting vulnerability. Or something like XXE. You might be able to upload a file, but that XML file isn't being displayed in any place you as the end user see, but it does get processed somewhere on the back end. Similar with like SSRF, that's type of concept. And these out-of-band types of payloads and responses, obviously they're on everybody's mind recently because of Log4j. And Burp Suite has a great setup to be able to work from the Burp proxy, have a collaborator that you can send this data to, and that can help you map back. This was a particular payload. I submitted it to this particular field against this particular app, and then the payload basically gets tagged so you can map it back. There's another great tool out there called Pingbin. Does pretty much the same thing, where if you just go to their website, it will give you a random alphanumeric string. And if you submit that string as a part of a payload, you want to just see, do you have an RCE that you can execute a ping on? Can you do a DNS lookup, for example, through a JNDI call? This will give you, this will listen for those callbacks, and it will tell you, this was a DNS connection from this IP address, and here was the string that you threw in there. And you can see it's even got an example for XXE. So really great tool. Now, with both Pingbin and Burp Suite Collaborator, remember, you're sending to a third party about potentially vulnerable applications. mostly the IP address that it's coming from. So you might also want to set up on your own environment, your own AWS or other cloud instance, this type of listener. And you can just easily do that with PingBin. Go check out the Git repo here. Of course, you can throw in these XXE, XSS payloads, but any good part of your toolbox should include a good Rickroll URL. So definitely make sure you have those on hand, because those are the most fun ways to demonstrate that the vulnerability existed.
Thanks for not letting us down.
I'm never going to give you up, Paul. I'm going to let you down. There are some other things that here's some lists of tools, as well as kind of getting into the future. We could talk about WebAssembly. Eventually, there will be more websites where you will run into HTTP2 and maybe HTTP3 in the future. Burp Proxy and Zetattack, I think Zetattack Proxy has some support, but I know Burp has some support for HTTP2, at least the easier parts that are text-based in terms of request response pairs. But those protocols get into a little bit of kind of multiplexing, if you will, and a little bit more complicated, and they're not as easy as the start of HTTP1. But that's for the future. So a couple things I try to do this quickly, even though I didn't go as quickly as I thought. Portswigger.net, they have a great web application security lab, tons of resources there. Obviously, it's going to be biased about how to use Burp for these topics, but there are plenty of topics that you could use, honestly, any proxy for, and they're going to teach you a lot. Zetattack Proxy, bunch of videos, bunch of content as well. Go to the bug bounty platforms as well. HackerOne, you'll hopefully call it Hackeroni, because that's just a much better pronunciation. BugCrowd has their own university with lots of information. And Paul was also mentioning a bunch of vulnerable web apps. OWASP has the web-based one called, the most recent one that's well-maintained is Juice Shop. And they also have a list of just a bunch of different known vulnerable applications and CTFs in this web applications directory. So go pick one that's that's been updated within 2020 maybe, or 2021. There's even a couple that are well maintained in 2022. Great places to start. And I mentioned Angband is sort of a text-based adventure. We've gone on an adventure that I've done very quickly and talked relatively quickly. So this is where we choose our own adventure. And this is kind of a shout out to Discord. Let us know, where should we go from here? Because there's a lot more web we could do. There's definitely more mobile hacking with the Android SDK, even Corellium out there for iOS, that type of engineering, or that type of testing. Reverse engineering, we could teach some basics on ARM from Azaria Labs. There's Ghidra that we didn't even mention about. Ghidra even had its own log4j vulnerability, which is always fun. Plus, there's lots of fuzzing. Fuzzing's a little bit tougher because it's potentially going to get expensive when you're spinning up cloud systems or cloud services workloads to do the fuzzing. So the couple catches there, things to be aware of. And even through this site, gamehacking.academy, if you're just interested in binary analysis and kind of game-oriented hacking. So let me just say thank you and figure out how to throw over to Tyler. Well, Adrian, you might have some questions.
Yeah, actually, we're going to do our challenge real quick since we're at the top of the hour here. But the challenge is the infamous packet analysis tool, Wireshark. What was its original name? First person to answer that will win the. Oh shit! Wow. Oh my God.
That was fast. Did you finish asking the question before the answer?
I'm gonna have to come up with tougher questions for next time.
The larger question is how did you pronounce the original name?
I pronounced it ethereal because it seemed to me like that's what they were going for, but I've heard people say ethereal also. How did you say it?
I think I originally started out with ethereal and then kind of fell into ethereal before Wireshark, which doesn't leave much to that imagination on how to pronounce it.
Yeah. Wireshark is pretty easy to do. Organizers and panelists don't vote. Cool. I haven't done so we actually use GoToWebinar for the virtual B-Sides Knoxville. So we've done it. I've never done a poll, so I've never seen what it looks like before. It's nice. It looks like Tyler is the presenter.
See my screen all right?
Do we have to stop the poll to, or
Think
can the
so.
poll continue?
I see the screen now.
You see my screen all right?
Yep, we've got it.
No, appreciate it. We've had a lot of great resources here. This is a lot of material to cover in a 1-hour webinar, so we are going a little over, but I will kind of speed run some of mine, and we will have a follow-up series diving into some of the more nitty-gritty, maybe even some of the specific labs around offense, reverse engineering, mobile hacking. Each of these are topics that have been asked for, and we will work to get one of those done very soon. So my part of this is going to just run through some of the tips and tricks that I've run into doing offensive operations, how to use labs, labs for testing vulnerabilities, exploits, how to set these labs up, maintain them, and do a lot of the automation. There is a great amount of things that you can do with manual labs, and you'll want to get familiar with how to set up the hardware, how to configure and integrate different things, caveats to some of the physical hardware, deploying OSs, how admins do certain things, and how software is configured and installed. But with all that manual work, you want to have a process that allows you to do this in a much more efficient manner. Especially if you're scaling this, you have to do this for multiple engagement, different ops, different vulnerabilities that come out. You got to be able to do this very quickly. So some of that is something that we will try and cover in more depth in some of the other labs. But from this standpoint, a couple of the things that I wanted to cover are the types of labs. You're going to have very specific goals as you do this. And Adrian mentioned this before, but when you're building these, each of these labs has considerations to consider. If you're doing an IR lab, you want to make sure that you've got things segmented, protected. You've got very specific hardware. You've got things that detect and are configured so it doesn't look like a incident response or a threat detection or a virtual machine, so that some of the payloads don't detonate when they detect these things. So figuring out what your goal is, what you're going to use the lab for, or if it's just a general purpose lab, makes a difference in how many things you put in there, how big you go, and how much you want to automate and reconfigure. I have a lab that stands up all the time that has some very specific configurations. I know how it's going to operate, and I throw things in and out of it all the time just to learn. Then I have very specific things for testing exploits as well as Active Directory. I have known good labs that I have expected outcomes and behavior. So each of these are considerations as you build these labs to make sure you cover and think out and design. And again, manual is not a bad way to start. And if you're just getting into this, you're just getting into offense, you're just getting into building labs, definitely do some of the stuff manually so you understand it, as well as learn why it is nice to have tools such as I'll talk about in just a second to automate and deploy these differently. We've covered a lot about the costs. Know some of your setups, the caveats. OPSEC considerations are big pieces when you're doing offensive operations or even some of the threat hunting or hunting bad actors. You want to know what's being exposed. You want to have a good plan for how you connect into different boxes. You want to secure your offensive infrastructure or even secure your cloud infrastructure that you're using. So what ISPs able to block? What kind of traffic are they seeing? Are you using VPNs to get in and out? Are you using proxies and Tors? All of these things are considerations that you want to consider as you're building this. The local security of your local network and your host machine. If you're using a work machine, you don't want to have exploits or C2 or things that you're testing compromise your local machine. So make sure that you're considering how you're using that, building out the security process to do this correctly, and know what your use cases are. Some great projects I want to shout out to that I'll reference here. Obviously, Carlos Dark Operator. He has got some great resources for building some of the automated users. Chris Long, Centurion. He has the automated lab and has done a ton of work around that. Bo has done a bunch around cloud hacking. They have a great webcast series as well as some training. CloudGoat, which is allowing you to set up vulnerable AWS instances for minor security. All of these guys have done a ton of work around some of these tools. So some quick projects you can go and do. Obviously, the manual stuff we've talked about. Considering if you're going to build it on bare metal, ESXi is a great way to get going. That's free. You can get that from VMware. One of the pro tips I have in a later slide is in order to get all of the VMware products, all of their enterprise products, even vSphere, Workstation, Fusion, all of those products are available through VMUG, which is about $200, $180 a year, with a coupon that allows you licenses to use all of their software within a lab. That's great from a standpoint of getting things like a SAN or some of their more advanced features that VMware has. So that's a great way to get going. Azure Labs, obviously Microsoft provides a ton of lab services that are available and able to do that at the Azure level. Automated Lab I'll talk about. That's a great way to deploy. It has the ability to do Terraform, Ansible on AWS, VirtualBox, VMware Workstation. It spins up multiple configurations. It's basically infrastructure as code. And so you can build it as extensive as you want or as minor as you want. And this can all be stood up and tore down in a matter of minutes, which is fantastic. There's a bunch of great write-ups that are in our handout about how to get started with Automated Lab. Detection Lab is another great one that covers setting up a fully automated SIM and detection solution with Windows environments or Windows hosts, as well as Elk Stack and a Splunk instance and all the sysmon things that you need to configure so that you can run your offensive tools, see what's detected, see how you're being picked up in the logs, and then start to build either more silent or better detections depending on if you're offense or defense. Red Elk.
I like Detection Lab too, Tyler, and I also like it for testing defensive tools as well.
Yes, it's great for how well it is.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, they've got some great resources in there. In the handout, I think I put some resources around what's built into that. You know, it's got Saracata, it's got Zeek, the old Bro stuff. It's got some Security Onion Stack stuff. So there's a ton in there, as well as Splunk and Sysmon, Windows Event Forwarding, all configured. The stuff usually takes, in my manual lab, it can take up to a week to build out some of this in a very controlled manner. This is all done for you and very well maintained. Similar thing from the Outflank guys. Red Elk is more of an offensive detection environment. It allows you to see what your tools are doing, as well as if defenders have reported your binaries to virus total, if it's being detected, what kind of indicators you're leaving, as well as some attribution pieces. And then CloudGoat is another one that builds vulnerable AWS environments. So with that, a couple just quick pro tips. Like I said, I'm kind of rushing through this and speed running this, but there will be additional info, and we'll walk through some of the nitty gritty of building some of this. But some of the things to consider as you're building out your environment, it's very time consuming and hard to build out real environments that have user accounts, that have different passwords, different names, different attributes, things in Active Directory, OUs, GPOs. So I linked a couple of the automated ways that I do that from Carlos, as well as I don't even know how to pronounce his name, Helgen Klein. He has a couple scripts about building realistic test users from CSV files and some automated things online to build out a really good Active Directory environment that looks real. So getting your environment set up and figuring out some of the scripts to make the time-consuming part realistic so you can test at scale becomes difficult. So a couple resources there. For the paranoid, a couple pro tips. If you're doing this for anything that is real or has some dangerous aspects to it, or you just want to segment some of this, making sure that you have things like USB dongles where you are attaching physical devices into a virtual machine that you use for managing or connecting into your lab environments. That way you're separating your main host, which I always recommend no matter how you're doing this, just not using the bridging or using NAT. Those things, you know, if you're just doing some basic lab stuff and testing building machines, that's fine, or operating out of a VM, that's fine. But if you're building this to test payloads, do operations, or any kind of malware dev or IR, make sure that you're separating out your physical NICs, building those lab and those connections separate from your normal network, and having the VLANs and home network configurations built out properly. Again, I mentioned VMUG, great place to get a bunch of things. Microsoft Visual Studio, they give that free, signing up with an account, as well as if you're a student, you get a bunch of testing and software. All the licenses from Microsoft can be used on a trial basis, usually 180 days. So some good resources there. But you want to automate as much as you can. As you get into this more and you build enough of these labs, tear them down, bring them back up, it gets very old to build the same thing over and over and over. So using things like Vagrant, Packer, Terraform, Docker, and PowerShell, there's a bunch of resources and links to build your lab using whichever one of those technologies, and bare metal and hypervisors that correlate to that in a very automated fashion. And I would definitely recommend spending the time to build the code, get some of your config files done, building out the Terraforms, so that you have the ability to do this very quickly and efficiently, and you don't waste a bunch of time doing the same thing over and over. If you're trying to test things like Mac OS, you'll run into some challenges with VMware Workstation on Windows. There's a great tool called Unlocker that allows you to install the latest Mac OS on VMware Workstation. Very, very simple DLL. We've used that many times. It's a great resource. There's also things like proxying and figuring out how to utilize this up in the cloud and do it in a way that you can connect and kind of get some of the testing advantages of local hardware. Ngrok, Proxifier, Cloudflare, ptunnel, all of these are great resources that I use on a regular basis for connecting into my lab and passing traffic in very specific manners. If you're getting started, laptop's usually enough. Make sure you consider your VMware license. There's obviously VirtualBox and some other free ones. Hyper-V's built into Windows 10. Those are options. I definitely recommend VMware just from personal experience and having done this a lot. There's dedicated hardware. We talked about the Intel NUCs. Any old hardware will work. Your laptop will work. Just use something to get started. If you're going to do ESXi, I would definitely recommend finding an old computer or building something. All of these are great options. Multiple NICs and some memory is definitely something you're going to need. Know your differences. If you're going to do this up in the cloud, you're going to build it out on there. Understand some of the physical limitations. If you're doing port mirroring or LAN tapping, a lot of that usually means physical access or some advanced configurations. You're doing hardware hacking and you have to do USB sniffing or things like Bus Pirate or JTagulator, where you're trying to interact with hardware and you're trying to do that in a virtual lab or environment. Those are also things that have to be considered. The cloud usually doesn't work. Some of the virtual stuff has to be passed through properly. Those are things that we need to consider.
And Tyler, just a note on, I don't know if you mentioned it or quickly on storage, especially if you're buying a Blade server. My experiences are rebuilding the RAID arrays and pulling out bad drives before you get started on your lab is advisable. Given my recent experiences, you can get those old Blade servers cheap, and typically they come with a RAID array that's been configured already, but those drives have been banged around. So we took our Blade server apart, blew out all the dust, cleaned all the components, put it back in, pulled out all the bad drives. You can buy replacements sometimes pretty cheaply, depending on what's in there, and rebuild that RAID array, then start building your lab. Because the worst thing that can happen is, you get it all built and then you have catastrophic failures.
Yep, 100%. And those are things to consider. Your speeds, again, if you're just getting started, your laptop usually works. You're usually using an SSD. That's fine. You're going to run into storage constraints. So using things like thin provisioning is great with VMware. Making sure that you're not allocating all that space out front and it just expands with time. Those are a great resource that you kind of need to understand as you're starting out. SSDs, again, they're getting a lot cheaper. I would very much consider that. Store your virtual machines or images that you hopefully templatize off on spinners, and then bring in the stuff that you're going to run live onto your SSDs.
Yep, agreed.
Again, home networking, really considering how you have your home network set up. I've got an updated version of this that I just did not finish with some considerations on how you build your home network, how you consider your lab integrating into your home network, as well as your business if you're working from home, and separating that from your kids, your phones, your IoT devices. So we'll cover some of that in another lab segment and have an updated diagram for some of the new stuff that I've just got done expanding on.
That looks awesome.
Definitely have recommended a bunch of things from Black Hill Security. Bo over there's got some stuff if you're interested in AWS, Azure testing, some of the cloud things. CloudGoat has got that. There's some great GitHub resources for your cheat sheets. All that is in the handout. I think I dumped 50 plus links and a bunch of collections of things that I've used for labs in the handout that should go out. Mentioned Pentester Academy, Hack the Box. All the CTFs have great options for labs that you can test in, very specific learning options. Those are things you should get involved in. Watch some of the Twitch streams that are out there. Definitely, we cover and have a bunch of the Twitch streamers that have shown up into the Discord. So, pay attention to our Discord, watch some of our shows. We'll mention some of those. As well as keep your notes and diagrams and passwords. A pro tip inside the description of each of your VMs as you're doing this, make a bunch of notes of what the VM's for, what you used it for, what passwords and user accounts you've set up in there, because you'll get 3 months down when you haven't used your lab and you come back and forget what the password is. Keeping those in a centralized spot that's usually tied to the VM or within notes that you'll always have available, that's a good thing to remember.
Yeah, I've got a whole section of my password database just for lab stuff.
Yeah, 100%. Me too. So yeah, don't forget to join all of our podcasts. We've got many great shows on the network here. Join Discord, Twitch. Reach out to any of us on any of the social medias. Security Weekly has a bunch of stuff that is inside of the realm of all the things we've talked about today. So if you have a question, all of us are great to reach out and respond as we can. But we are available on any of the social medias and through Security Weekly. So.
Yeah, and all of our podcasts, as well as the Discord link, Twitch, social media, if you go to securityweekly.com/subscribe, that's securityweekly.com/subscribe, subscribe to all of our shows, Discord, mailing list, it's all there. All the ways to subscribe and follow us are on that page.
Yes, awesome. Yeah, I actually had an ending slide set up here. Hopefully you can see that.
Yep.
With some of the links and stuff. But yeah, no, this is all great. Love the feedback. We're going to go through the Discord, take a look at your recommendations and things like that. Part of what we wanted to do here is to get a feel for what future webcasts you'd like to see. And I think we got a lot of good feedback on that. Somebody mentioned a blue team lab, how that would look different from maybe one that's focused on offensive testing, more on testing defensives. So that would be a good one. More mobile stuff. Yeah, drop any suggestions you have in the Discord there, and we will take a look and go through those. But thanks for attending today's Security Weekly Unlocked webcast. If you discuss further in the Discord, and as Paul mentioned, we've got a bunch of podcasts. If you're not already listening to the podcast, securityweekly.com/shows. Anything else you want to mention, Paul, before we wrap?
I think that's it.
All right, that's a wrap. Thanks everybody for coming, and check out the /webcast on securityweekly.com because we got more of these on the way.